The following story is also available as a read-only version. Check the link in the description if you're interested. This short story and its audiobook are directly inspired by Isaac Arthur, specifically his video on colonizing Venus. It attempts to remain within the loosely defined lore he has set up for his colonization series, and expand on it to tell a personal story, but it is of course in no way canon. It's more of a fan fiction, really. If you haven't seen it yet, you should really check out Isaac's video, and his channel in general. Both are quite good.
Clouds as far as the eye can see. A melange of cream, sand, and brown sugar. One might be forgiven for mistaking this landscape to be the Christian interpretation of heaven. After all, angels with shining wings fly gracefully through the clouds, orbited by smaller seraph. The platform suspended in the air can only be the gate to the abode of God, as only He would have the power to create a palace floating in the sky. Yes, the round shapes on top of them do resemble balloons, but who would one be to pass judgment on the aesthetics of divine architecture? Of course, the winged figures pirouetting through the sky are not angels. They are humans, Venuvians as they call themselves with pride, enjoying one of their favorite pastimes. In the semi-unreal space of augmented reality, they swoop through a glowing, pill-shaped arena a kilometer long and 300 meters tall. On either end are 5 rings, each 3 meters in diameter. 2 teams of 7 try to direct a blue sphere with a luminescent trail, which they call a comet, through these rings. One of these players is Yook. This is his story. The comet was catching up. The little marker in the corner of his eye was blinking faster and faster, until the blue orb appeared in his field of vision, a trail of sparks and light behind it. It was heading for one of the goal rings at breakneck speed. Whoever sent it that way had done impressive work. If Yook was fortunate, a strong gust of wind would lend him some more speed, and he could at least redirect the comet to fly out of the playing field. It would result in a foul, but at least his team would get another chance to win the game. With clenched teeth, Yook dove forward, forcing the most out of the thrusters on his wingsuit. Despite knowing better, he had never quite parted with the idea that if he just concentrated hard enough, he could push them beyond their limits. Banking to the side ever so slightly, he avoided a dense cloud that would have slowed him down, flying just close enough to disturb its surface, but far enough to make the deviation from his optimal flight path minimal. A cone of green lightning sizzled along the comet's trail. Following his mental command, Yook's right retina displayed the feed from his right-hand camera. Nina Singh, the green Valkyrie, had descended right behind the comet, and was pushing the tip of her staff into its glowing trail. The closer she got, the more she slowed it down, but it was clear she had no hopes of actually touching the comet and bringing it under her control. This was her attempt at buying Yook a few more precious seconds of time. Tilting forward, he brought his arms closer to his body, losing height, speeding up, and readying to fly in a low arc. This was his chance at bringing the comet back into play. When Yook extended his arms again, Nina came back into view, struggling with 2 enemy kinchers trying to push her off course. If they managed to make physical contact, the thrusters of her wingsuit would deactivate for 3 seconds. If she managed to touch them with her staff, it would be theirs that went out, leaving them unable to catch up. Thus, they had to fly just outside her reach, always looking for that lapse in attention that would allow them to tackle. The kincher flying above her spotted an opportunity and dipped rapidly, but Nina rolled in the air and he missed her by a hand's breadth. Sensing her distraction, the one flying below boosted himself up, but she writhed to the side at the last possible moment, avoiding contact and slamming the end of her staff into his head. The tip broke contact with the comet's trail only for half a second, but it was enough. Nina's maneuvering had cost her speed, and the comet was accelerating back to its original velocity. Even though she caught the very end of the trail again, her staff's grip wasn't powerful enough, and the comet escaped her reach. Now it was all up to Yook. Sending a tiny prayer to wherever Jesus was, he went stiff, made himself as aerodynamic as possible, and raced forward in a reverse arc, pulling up at the last moment, using his wingsuit and helmet cameras to ascertain the comet's position. He was in it for keeps now. The possibility of pushing the comet out of field had gone away when he first tilted down. Yook held his breath as the shining orb passed above him, jerked upward, and made his thrusters wince. Taking a quick breath, he pushed aside all camera streams and used his eyes for this final maneuver. It was the best perspective for body orientation. He was almost upright now, right arm extended, spinning. The comet was right there. He knew he would hit it. Time slowed down to a crawl. Everything moved as though it were dragging a parachute several kilometers wide. Yook adjusted the angle of his elbow ever so slightly, lining up his palm with the incoming comet. He could already see it bounce away. It passed through his hand, just like that. Instead of doing what it ought to do, the comet continued on its path, as though Yook wasn't even there. He didn't have time to be confused. The fraction of a moment that his upward momentum would hold him straight in the air was over, and Yook dropped like a stone. He curled up into a ball and rolled forward until he was upside down, then straightened and extended his arms to catch the air in his wingsuit. Flying a curve, he became horizontal again, only to see the comet pass through the goal ring in his rear vision camera. The orb disappeared, sending out a blue pulse that went through the whole playing field. The words, "Game over. Goldbirds win 5-4 appeared before his eyes, accompanied by a flight guide to his team's launch platform. Yook did not understand what had just happened.
"Do you even have depth perception?" Nina Singh screamed.
Her green wingsuit was half peeled off, and she was pointing her finger accusingly. The girl was 19, a year younger than Yook, and had a slim, athletic figure optimal for gliding. Her soft features, courtesy of her North Indian father and Slavic mother, were beautiful even when distorted by anger.
"I told you it went right through,"
Yook insisted, taking off the skin-tight pants of his own wingsuit.
"Oh, fuck off. It's the comet. It can't pass through your hand. It doesn't work like that."
The green Valkyrie was all but foaming at the mouth.
"Actually, it can because it's not real,"
Adam Mundi, her fellow Turner, interjected.
"It's a digital construct of augmented reality, not a physical object. I know you never turned that shit off, Nina, so I wouldn't expect you to remember, but nothing in that field is actually real."
Adam was slim of frame, and so low in body fat that one could see even the most minute muscular contraction of his exuberant gesticulations.
"Shut the fuck up with your purer-than-thou real vision shit," said Nina. "Are you gonna defend Yook's lies now?"
"No, I'm just saying maybe you should calm down a bit. That was a difficult stunt. Impossible for most, and Yook almost pulled it off. Could have happened to the best of us." Adam pulled up his briefs.
"Not the best of us," Nina retorted. "It wouldn't have happened to me."
"Stop being a diva, Nina," Ronald Bateman said as he entered the locker room. He was their coach, an American whose ancestry might have included several bears, judging from his imposing figure and dense carpet of rusty hair peering over his collar. "You may be the best turner out there, no offense to you, Adam, but Yook is an outfielder. The game is entirely different for him, and you couldn't do it as well as he does." He scratched his beard. It was cut to give the illusion of 3 even surfaces, not a single hair protruding a millimeter over the razor line. As far as I know, I'm the only one in here who has a nickname in the cultural zeitgeist, and is regularly referred to as wasted on her team online. Nina was looking for her civilian clothes, the location of which she had, as so often, forgotten. Shukra Chase is a sport in its infancy, remember that. Nobody cares about it outside of Venus, and it'll be years before that changes, if it ever does. By the time it has even the fraction of the popularity of any Earth sport, your abilities will be overshadowed by younger, better athletes, and no one will remember your name. They were harsh words, and Yook didn't want to believe them himself, though rationally they were likely true. Their team, the Cloud Vikings, was one of only 10 in existence, and that was with everyone on Venus being crazy about having their own competitive sport. Now apologize to Yook, Bateman insisted. Even though none of them were children anymore, his voice still carried the authority that it had back then. Nina grimaced and put on a pair of boxer shorts. I'm sorry I was a bitch just there. That was too much. You're a good outfielder, but you have to stop lying and own up to your mistakes. Everyone turned to him, and Bateman gave him the look of paternal expectance he had perfected over 2 decades of being Yook's godfather. Yook shook his head. I swear to God it passed right through my hand. I can't believe it either. Nina rolled her eyes, and Bateman shook his head. The mind can play tricks on you. This was an important game and an unexpected failure. Your brain may be in need of some time to cope with it. Ah yes, humans are fallible and only technology is flawless. Good thing we have our coach, Adam snarked. No, that's not what I'm saying, but I am a medical professional, as you may well know, because half of you come out of the wombs in my practice, and all of you received your pediatric gene therapies from me as well. Bateman took a deep breath. Don't worry. It's okay to lose every once in a while, especially against a team like the Goldbirds. We're still in the top 3, we're still pioneers of this sport, and we can try for the championship again next season. But what about the comet going through my hand? Yook asked emphatically. There was silence. You're serious? This is the hill you want to die on? Even Adam seemed incredulous. When was the last time I lied about anything? Where's all this distrust suddenly coming from? Look, there's footage of everything from every angle. I watched you guys play and I saw you miss that comet. Barely, but still. You should take some time to think. It was a fatherly expression of empathy, but also a final warning to cease lying. Barcelona was one of the first businesses that had opened on Niobe when commercial space became available. Many large Earth investors wanted the prestige of being the trailblazers opening this or that establishment on Venus. But the responsible committee was made up mostly of people who considered themselves locals of the Yellow Planet, and when the time came to pick a breakfast diner, they gave the license to Martí Mascarell, who had been operating the Vulcan Station cafeteria for 3 years at that point. The Catalan had expanded his operation since then, and what was once a windowless shack crammed between a hardware store and Ronald Bateman's medical practice now occupied a prime spot in Venus's very own shopping mall, the Paradise Concourse. Depending on their personal taste, patrons could choose either a generic hacienda-style skin to perceive an augmented reality, or a more playful decor in Gaudiesque modernisme the owner never tired of recommending. Though most Venuvian purists preferred to see their homeworld's cloudscapes outside the curved window that spanned almost the entire back wall of the diner, a collection of mostly maritime vistas from northeastern Iberia were available. To Yook, Barcelona was home. It was, after all, his father's restaurant. The old man had a comforting smile on his face, and the shusho and the tall glass of ice-cold horchata de chufa put aside for his son. You played very well out there. I'm proud of you. He ruffled Yook's curly hair, a gesture he'd once again come to appreciate since leaving puberty. "Catching that comet was impossible. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "No, it wasn't," Yook responded, his voice heavy with resignation. "I hit it perfectly. Just didn't care." Martí Mascaret nodded, but couldn't hide the frown on his face. "We'll have to see what's to be done about that then. You want some toro? I just finished a new batch, almost like the real thing. Well, half of the ingredients actually are the real thing." "I think I'll just take this to go." Yook went behind the counter to pack up the food on his tray. "Out celebrating with the team early then, I see. Or is it the type of thing where you drink your sorrows away?" Martí jokingly asked. "No, they think I'm a liar, and I made a fool out of myself. To be honest, I think they might be right, but I'm too afraid to check, so I'm going to the greenhouse instead." Yook had always found it easy to be more honest with his father than he was with himself. "Do you want to talk about it?" Martí asked. "Thanks, but not now, Papa." He knew the old man meant well, but he needed to be alone for a moment. On Venus, the structures most approaching greenhouses grew a small variety of genetically engineered biomass stock crops, the products of which were refined, reprocessed, flavored, shaped, and turned into dishes that were almost indistinguishable from those made with real ingredients. However, there was something in the mind of humans that felt such unnatural food would always be different from the organically grown alternatives, no matter how identical the substances in question were on a chemical level. The general consensus was that this was an illusion only present in people's heads, but it did have a very real effect on the enjoyment of their food. As a practical project for his botanical studies at the Oxford Remote University, Yook had, with the help of Adam Mundy, who was studying engineering, built a greenhouse modelled after the farming towers of Earth. It was suspended from a balloon of its own, 25 clicks behind Niobe, which was moving with the dawn of the planet, and caught a good bit of daylight. Most greenhouses were even farther behind, between 300 and 500 kilometers, but Yook liked the idea of a retreat in the clouds that he could fly to on a whim when he needed to escape the labyrinth of hermetically sealed habitats. To retain the benefits of radiation protection that the lifting gas provided, fiber optic cables collected sunlight at the top of the balloon and channeled it down to the hydroponic racks, where Yook grew aubergines, tomatoes, artichokes, garlic, beans, and, most importantly, tiger nuts, or chufas. His father used what he harvested in a variety of traditional dishes, but Yook was mostly concerned with his horchata containing real chufas. When he stepped through the airlock, he found that he wasn't the only one there. Adam was sitting cross-legged on the floor, eating a nutrient bar. The Turner had a tablet computer on his lap and was watching a replay of the game. "So back in the locker room I was a liar, but now you want to hang out?" Yook asked, offloading his bag and almost slamming it into Adam's foldable glider by accident. As usual, he had put it in the wrong spot. "I'm sorry, I really am. That was inappropriate of me back there. But you have to admit that it sounds completely incredible." Adam held up his computer. "I looked at the situation at all possible angles, and you definitely missed. By a tiny amount, but you missed. Don't tell me you haven't looked at the footage yet." "Why do you think I flew to my cabin in the clouds, Adam?" The question was rhetorical. "Here's the thing. I want to believe you. We're friends, that's what friends do. So me being me, I wanted to eliminate all the options first. Now that the league is about to go semi-professional and is streamed over the internet, everything is being recorded from every angle. You have drones, but you also have multiple shoot cameras, and all feeds are available to anyone. Or so it is generally assumed." With a theatrical motion, he threw the datapad into the corner. "Player POVs are recorded through helmet cameras, which makes no difference to the audience, but we as players tend to use our eyes as much as possible." What's your point? Yook was irritated enough that Adam had come here in the first place. He wasn't about to listen to one of his insufferable rationalizations of human fallibility. For legal reasons, no footage recorded of a retinal implant can be owned by anyone but the wearer of that implant, unless they turn it into a separate file later. That's why it is not streamed. Therefore, none of the footage we have access to actually shows us what you saw, and with AR not being real and all that, it's not impossible that it diverges. So now I'm hoping that you record your games like a professional athlete. Adam had his hands clasped together as though praying. Are you kidding me? I never turn recording off. What if I run into a well-built female and can't play it back later? Yook switched on the menu of his augmented reality suit and scrolled through his recordings. Here I was, hoping you would use this technology to diligently record your games and watch them back to improve your skills. You should use your imagination from time to time. It'll make sure your problem-solving skills don't deteriorate. He picked the tablet back up. There wasn't even a dent in it. Would you care to watch that moment back with me? Yook gave Adam access to his feed. A glimmer of hope restored in him. He'd been ready to give up, to accept that he was, for some reason, so traumatized by failure that his brain had made up an alternate version of events where he was not to blame for their defeat. But now, it turned out maybe that wasn't the case. He sat down and rewound to the end of the game. Everything was right as he remembered it. The comet came into view, his hand was extended, and he hit it right in the middle. A rock dropped from his heart, and he was annoyed with himself for not having looked at this footage earlier. He should have never doubted his memory. See, this is the footage from your helmet camera, said Adam, sending the file to Yook. This one was clearly different. His fingers barely passed through the comet, which didn't count. The palm of his hand had to hit its center for it to be bounced back. It's different, said Yook after a long pause. It's actually different. Copeland Sporting Goods had only a small section for traditional sporting equipment. Large interior spaces were limited, and though there were some exterior playing fields with large nets to prevent equipment from falling into oblivion, most of the games and activities popular on Earth had not gained much popularity on Venus. Until FIFA followed through with their promise to construct the first airborne football stadium, the locals had to stick to flying. And fly they did. Races in gliders, planes, and blimps, often through virtual obstacle courses, were commonplace. Extreme sports like bungee or cloud ski were often the subject of advertisements targeted at tourists, of which Niobe, for a settlement of barely more than 10,000, saw many. Thus, the vast majority of Copeland Hong's inventory was flight-related. Wingsuits, micro-thrusters, tarps, battery packs, and graphene cables lined the shelves. The owner himself was walking up and down the aisles, a lollipop in his mouth. It was impossible to determine Hong's true age, as he behaved like an arrogant business student in his early 20s and dressed the part, but had the type of wrinkles typical of someone who had been old once and gone back to being young using costly rejuvenation treatments. He might have been anywhere between 30 and 200, though broaching the subject with him was prone to escalation. He wasn't too old to start new projects, though, which was why the owner of the first sporting goods store on Venus was also the primary organizer of the planet's first semi-professional Shukra Chase league. Everybody knew he had great plans for the game, and though most people found his personality grating, nobody could deny his skill and work ethic. All of the sports popular on Mars were either adapted versions of old Earth games, or could easily be played back on the blue planet as well. Shukra Chase was the thing that Venus, and only Venus, could own, and Hong had been with it from the very beginning. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked, looking at the comparisons of the official footage and the recording from Yook's retinal implant. "They're different things," said Adam. "Can't you see that? The AR projections were different. That's why Yook didn't hit the comet." Your fucking AI is broken then. Hong pointed at Yook with his lollipop. Simple as that. Yook shook his head. We ran tests. Everything is calibrated correctly. Everything works as it should. You ran the wrong tests then. Hong shrugged and started walking away. We didn't run the tests. Nina Singh ran the tests. She studies AR design and development at Oxford Remote. I can guarantee you that she didn't run the wrong tests. Adam insisted. Yeah, because college students always already know everything about everything in the first year of training. Ni gai wo gun, Mundi. I'm busy. So I've heard, Adam retorted. Going to Earth again, are we? Hong laughed dismissively. Flying to the Mars Driver tomorrow. Is that fucking illegal now, is it? It'll be half a year at least before I return, and you should thank me for every single day I'm gone, because I'll be getting sponsors for the league you guys might one day earn serious money in. He looked at Adam and tilted his head. Well, not you, Mundi, but Masquerade here is actually pretty good when he doesn't blame shit on the AR. Hong extended his arm to ruffle Yook's hair, but he stepped back. Only his father got to do that. How about you make sure your sport works on a technical level before getting sponsors in prematurely? Yook asked, anger in his voice. What if this happens again, during a broadcast with millions of viewers, and Shukra Chase loses all legitimacy? Listen, Bendan, your bullshit is bullshit. Hong sounded like a hissing snake. I know what I'm doing. And if you don't shut up, I'll kick you out of the league and ban you both from playing forever. I might ban the whole team, I don't care. There's always more players out there, and the little scandal might give the sport some more exposure, so don't force my hand. Without giving them time to respond, he marched to his desk, fuming. When Yook and Adam tried to follow, he pointed at the door with his lollipop and shouted, Out! Go kao ni ma de bi!
The guy spends more time on Earth than he does Venus these days, Coach Bateman said. He was sitting with Yook, Adam, and Nina in a corner booth of Esbarceló, eating crespes and drinking horchata. He's not a true Venuvian, Nina decided, arms crossed. He is dedicated to the Shukra Chase League. Nobody can deny that, Bateman reminded her. Of course he might grow fabulously rich off it. But that's just capitalism at work. Besides, he's been visiting Earth at least every 5 years ever since he came here. He gets his treatments there, says he doesn't trust my competence. Bateman seemed amused by this notion. But he cares about Shukra Chase, that cannot be denied. If that were true, he would at least look into it. Now we have who knows what glitches in the software Shukra Chase depends on, and he's not willing to do anything about it. Yook hadn't touched his drink. The whole situation made his stomach ache. Not only was it unfair toward him and his team, but it was immoral. Hong doesn't care about the game, he only cares about the money, and I can't stand by and let that happen. It's dishonorable. I admire you being a straight shooter. It's very commendable, but there's really not much we can do. Bateman didn't show the slightest hint of resignation. If Hong doesn't want to look into it, it's not going to be looked into. If we put this on the internet, it'll be called out as fake, or do exactly what you guys are afraid of and hurt the league's future. Probably both. I don't like it, but I think we'll have to cut our losses. No way, said Adam. We're not turning tail. We're not Earthlings or Martians. Here on Venus we do not tolerate corruption. You always said this. Exactly. Venus is about real, honest people. We can't let something like this stand. It's a cancer that'll spread into all aspects of our culture, Yook declared. Bateman smiled. You know, I'm glad you guys are the first significant generation of native Venuvians. But it's not that simple. Above all else, Venus is a haven for criminals. Or at least that's how the rest of the solar system sees us. Because of the data sharing laws, a disproportionate amount of people who live here are petty criminals, who manage to escape the authorities of their homeworlds. If that's not fertile soil for corruption,
I don't know what is. Nina puffed. People hunted by the despots of Earth and Mars, willing to build a life for themselves here. Venus is a place where everyone can be judged by their merits, not their past. I can't help but support your idealism, Bateman conceded. If you want to put this on the internet, you should. But be aware of the consequences. All three of you were set to become historical figures from the moment you were conceived in my lab, so you have always had great power. Your actions will shape the culture of this world for generations to come. All the more reason to do the right thing, then, said Yook, his voice steely with determination. The right thing turned out to be something highly illegal. Under false pretense, they had borrowed the maintenance blimp that Nina's father owned, and were heading for Copeland Hong's residence. They'd spent several days preparing this operation, as they waited for the fusion sprint ship Siegfried to depart from orbit. The only other Earthbound ship departing this week was the Muru, a cargo freighter that would need at least a month to reach its destination, as opposed to the 3 days ETA for the passenger-fitted Siegfried. Needless to say, Hong wasn't going to take the slow route. His home was not connected to the rest of Niobe by walkways or stream routes, but floated 5 clicks away, enveloped in a particularly stubborn bank of clouds, the existence of which Hong presumably prolonged with the machines. Until the office complex of the International Shukra Chase League was built, a project that was still years beyond the horizon, all of the game's software was run on a server in Hong's house. If they wanted to sift through the source code, they would have to break in. The structure's remoteness and cloud cover worked to their advantage. Nobody could see them being in a place they shouldn't be, and the automated security systems, which were sparse and considered largely superfluous to begin with, would be forced to let them dock. Emergency maintenance work was not as common nowadays as it had in Niobe's early years, but the laws and protocols persisted. Yook sat at the control table, maneuvering the vessel with precision. Though the front window provided 180-degree vision and the instruments displayed a plethora of information, augmented reality gave Yook the ability to see through the hole when he turned around. The blimp still appeared as a ghostly overlay, and a virtual representation of Hong's home, reconstructed from information picked up by outside sensors, appeared as a glowing mesh behind it. He docked with a vertical airlock on the western side of the house, and generated a pressure seal. Now how about this thing? Nina produced a copy of her father's skeleton keycard and inserted it into the slot. The technology was unsafe, utterly archaic, and, ironically, the result of people wanting to keep their privacy. Every habitat on Venus had its own control panel, because every habitat on Venus was, de facto, a vehicle. If, for whatever reason, it drifted off course, sunk unexpectedly, or threatened to collide with another structure, maintenance teams were deployed to find the cause and avoid catastrophe. Naturally, they required access to the habitat's control panel, which usually ran on the home's server, which also operated all the personal computers inside. Having someone capable of accessing one's private computer system at any time was an uncomfortable idea at best, so, as a compromise, any access needed to be manual, but manual access needed to be possible. For budgeting reasons, a simple keycard system was implemented. Nobody was entirely happy with it, but there had been more important matters at hand at the time. Yook, Nina, and Adam had used the completely illegal keycard copy to get into a great many places, driven by the natural curiosity and carelessness of teenagers. They'd been inside the experimental spore gardens, marveling at the mesmerizing spectacle of interacting bioluminescent particles dancing around each other on controlled airstreams like figure skaters. On a particularly dangerous expedition, they had visited the supercomputer in the night zone behind the horizon, where they had almost been caught by a scientist coming from a late session in the virtual reality lounge. So far, they had always been faster and smarter, but then they had never tried to get into a private residence before. The door gave a satisfied beep, and the hatch split to reveal a ladder descending into a small room. Nina and Yook pulled opaque gel masks over their heads and climbed down. Adam stayed behind inside the blimp, keeping an eye out for the unlikely case somebody came out here looking for them. He'd be keeping an ear on radio traffic and deflect the occasional survey drone passing through the area. Despite the antechamber being pressurized, the hatch to the maintenance blimp had to be closed for the door to Hong's residence to open. It was mechanically impossible for both doors of an airlock to be open at the same time. They stepped into a round foyer with dark wooden paneling on the walls. A Chinese dragon made of jade stared at them from atop a 3-storied fog fountain, the subtle glow of which illuminated the room. Copeland Hong's residence was even larger on the inside than the sprawling exterior suggested. Most of it was tastefully minimalist, with dark earth tones and the occasional accent of intense green and red. There was much natural wood, often carved with traditional Chinese patterns, and carpeted flooring. Some rooms were significantly more opulent, featuring traditional artworks, Mandarin calligraphy, and vases in glass cages. In the living room they found a gargantuan engraving enameled with gold. It depicted a scene of Niobe and the Venusian skyscape, people in wingsuits darting around it like birds of prey. How exactly Hong could afford all this was a mystery. Especially the wood wasn't something he could have purchased in such quantities from the sporting goods store alone, and at this point the Shukra Chase leak probably cost a lot more than it generated in revenue. The door to his server room was decorated with a painted relief of a smiling, overweight Chinese man wearing traditional robes of red silk. He was holding a golden staff in one hand and what appeared to be a paper ship in the other, all the while riding some sort of striped predator Yook faintly recognized but couldn't quite place. What lay behind was more reminiscent of a shrine than a high-capacity simulation computer cooled with liquid nitrogen. The exterior casing was built out of a very light wood, decorated with herds of jumping deer and framed with gilded aluminium. The control interface was shaped like a crane with screens embedded into its spread wings. A variety of physical ports was assorted on the bird's chest. "What the fuck?" Nina whispered more to herself than Yook. Indeed. This is the last thing I would have expected from a guy like Hong. Aside from a golden animal, the hand of which waved back and forth behind the counter, Copeland Sporting Goods was as spartanically furnished as any place made ready for augmented reality. Why waste materials and add weight to a structure when it could all be done virtually? "I will never understand Earthlings," said Nina, and got to work. The way the system was set up, the simulation computer took data from the drones, wingsuits, and field beacons on a secure wireless network, overlaid the augmented reality, and sent the feeds back to the players over the same network. A one-way connection sent a set of video feeds to the streaming server, which then interacted with the world at large. This had the advantage of insulating the actual simulation computer from incursions over the internet, and had allowed Hong to cut back on complex encryption processes that would add nanoseconds of delay. If, like Nina, one had access to the physical simulation computer, reading out its data was a cakewalk. Still, she mumbled complaints. "What's the matter?" asked Yook. He found himself surprisingly calm for someone performing data burglary. "There's no source code. I'll have to decompile executables, which means a lot of junk data and no explanations for anything." "Will that be a problem?" Yook had never prided himself on his programming skills. Aside from the basics learnt in primary school, he had never expanded his knowledge. "Fortunately for you, I am very smart," Nina responded. "Plus I have a few tricks up my sleeve that'll help me figure out what each line of code actually does." "Well then we should probably pack it up. This place gives me the creeps." But it was not that easy. When they made their way back through Hong's estate, Yook grabbed Nina's arm and held her back. Something was different. "Did you open that door at any point?" He gestured toward the entrance of his semi-automated kitchen and recalled opening the door, looking inside and then closing it. But now it was open.
"Why would I do that?"
asked Nina, sounding irritated.
"Master, have you returned early?"
a female voice asked from the kitchen. Before they could run, a young woman in a cerulean robe stood in the doorway. Her face looked very Chinese, and perfectly symmetrical, almost unrealistically so. The rest of her added to that impression. She had an ideally proportioned hourglass figure, large but excellently shaped breasts, and skin so soft it looked straight out of a digitally retouched commercial. A mental command later, and Yook's suspicion was confirmed by a flag in augmented reality. This woman was a service android, custom-made, and prohibitively expensive. He'd never seen one of these before, at least not a pleasure model, which this one clearly was.
"Fuck,"
said Nina matter-of-factly, and bolted. Yook needed only a moment to run after her, but it was the moment that made the difference. With inhuman speed, the android leapt from a standing position and grabbed a hold of Yook, her thin hands closing like machine vices around his wrists. She subdued him with the might of a man 3 times her size, pinning him to the ground. As the android peeled off Yook's gel mask, he saw Nina climb the ladder to the airlock. He could only hope she and Adam made it out. The police investigator frowned at the sight of the android. He seemed as surprised by Copeland Hong's apparent wealth as Yook had been.
"You sure got yourself in a pickle there, boy. This is the first time anyone has broken into a residence that wasn't connected to the main network of Niobe. So in a way, you're making history."
The man gave Yook an ironic thumbs up.
"Wait a second, aren't you Marty Mascaray's son?"
"You're so deep in trouble, you would have bored a hole through Jupiter and come out the other side," Bateman said. "I can't believe you did this."
"What was I supposed to do?" asked Yook.
He couldn't face his father after this, so he'd asked for the next best thing. He and Bateman were in a private consultation chamber, traditionally reserved for suspects to talk to their attorneys. "Anything would have been better than breaking into the guy's home, Yook. Hong is flipping furious about this. He's banned the entire team from the league, and he will press charges against you when he comes back." The floor fell out from beneath Yook. Being arrested was all right somehow. It may not have clicked yet what the consequences of his current predicament might be, but being banned from Shukra Chase was real. He knew what it meant, and the fact that the entire team had been banned for his foolishness filled him with so much guilt that he felt it would make him vomit.
"What about Nina and Adam?" he finally heaved.
"They're all right, they got away. Nina's father has a problem on his hands now, though. It was his blimp you took and his keycard you copied. He's already covered for his daughter and accounted for his vehicle being in the area with some bogus call. Everybody knows he's lying, but he is the chief of maintenance, and people have empathy for his situation."
Bateman leaned back and folded his hands behind his head.
"They have empathy for you, too, but you are in the system now. We may only rarely make use of it, but there is rule of law on Venus. This will have consequences, and the way I know Hong, he will try to ruin your life forever."
"What about Papa?"
asked Yook. He felt as though he was in freefall. "He probably knows already, but if you call him here and own up to what you did, he will pretend he's hearing about it for the first time." Bateman took a deep breath. "We'll try to get you out of here, don't worry. I'll reason with Hong. We'll come to some form of agreement. But for Pete's sake, Yook, you're not a teenager anymore. You can't do this type of thing and get away with it." But Yook was not listening. All he could think about was the disappointment on his father's face. He couldn't do it. He couldn't tell the man who had nurtured him all his life that he had betrayed his trust. What had he been thinking?
34 days later. Anita Mutumbu hated microgravity. For all the Italian Art Deco interior design, vibrant colors and chromed furniture, the Fulmine did not offer the luxury of a spinning cylinder. Among the 25 Sprint ships in existence, it was the largest passenger liner and placed volume over quality. She was surprised to hear that it even serviced the Borman Station to Venus route, considering how sparsely traveled it was. But apparently tourists looking for a comparatively cheap Sprint ship ride to one of the solar system's most exotic vacationing spots were a patient bunch. Though she had no intention of doing anything of the sort, Anita could have passed for one of the extreme athletes Venus saw a lot of. She was a stocky, muscular woman of 39 years, her body still largely in its biological prime thanks to modern medical science. Her pine-cone brown skin was marred by scars on her hands and neck. She had chosen not to have them removed out of respect for the city she had left behind when she moved to Borman Station. Her short, thin dreadlocks were beginning to grey. Though she was saving up for a few sessions of longevity treatments, for a woman on a middle-class salary it was a significant investment, even where she lived. Vulcan Station was not to her liking, and she could not wait to get down to the surface. Years of living on the giant that was Borman Station must have spoiled her to this tiny habitat. She would have much preferred taking a shuttle straight down into the atmosphere, but formalities had to be observed, and the bumpy ride along the rotavator cable was something she was willing to endure to avoid the risk of being expelled from the planet by the local authorities. She prayed to the Vodun of the Void and the alien spirits of the planet below that they would tip the scales in her favor, and entered the crammed office of Security Director Francis Ben Isaac. The chief of all Venuvian law enforcement was sitting behind his desk in a black and yellow uniform, his face serious and more than a little standoffish. "Please, do be seated," he offered with a magnanimous gesture. "What can I do for you, Miss Mutombo?" "Thank you for your hospitality, Director. As you may have surmised, I work for the System Law Enforcement Coordination Agency," Anita began. "Slacker." Ben Isaac spoke the word as though it were an insult. "Venus is not a member of your organization, so you do understand that you have no authority here." Anita swallowed a clever remark. "Of course, sir, but we have no authority anywhere. Despite what the name suggests, we are not an enforcement agency, but help those organizations who are. I understand that the relationship between Sleka and the Venuvian government has been strained for quite some time." "I cannot fathom what would make you believe that relationship has improved," Ben Isaac interrupted, "but I will not brush you off just yet." "I'll cut the niceties short then." Anita could be patient with suspects and witnesses, but she found fellow cops being disrespectful a little harder to tolerate, especially if they were, for all intents and purposes, provincial. "I specialize in cold cases which are still of interest to Sleka members. Because of our access to a variety of police databases and know-how in handling advanced trolling algorithms, we can often find leads in the ripples of what certain crimes cause even years later." The security director made a rolling motion with his hand, communicating that he would rather she not bore him with technical details. "Well, a lead has emerged in a case that is over 2 centuries old, but which is still an acute cause for concern. There used to be a man called Wei Zheng, a bookmaker from Hangzhou, China. He made a fortune rigging every kind of game imaginable, operating beyond his hometown in Shanghai and Ningbo, eventually becoming a sort of kingpin in the Hangzhou Bay Area. His operation was eventually discovered and dismantled, but he managed to escape to Vladivostok with many of his financial assets intact. Instead of retiring on his fortune, he missed the thrill of running his empire so much that he tried to maintain it. He even expanded into the local scene of his new home city. The Russians did not appreciate this, and he was deported back to China, where he died in prison 20 years later, but his money and the channels he used for it were never recovered." Must have been frustrating to have all that money and not be allowed immortality, Ben Isaac noted, not without a slight hint of satisfaction in his voice. He was an agent of justice after all. Anita shook her head. Longevity treatments were not around back then. We missed that window by about a decade, and if he had lived long enough he would have been permitted to take the therapy under Chinese law, prison or not. He certainly would have been able to afford it. But he's dead and convicted. Why is this a cold case? The security director asked. She seemed to have sparked a certain curiosity in him, awakened the hunter instinct that every cop had. Wei Zheng is dead, yes, but his money isn't. His decentralized assets and channels were still being monitored by automated systems, and for a while activity in them was minimal. But 30 years after his death, his money sprung back to life. At first it was only old accounts and numbers connected to Wei Zheng, but the network eventually sprawled out into the solar system, taking on never-before-seen proportions. Somebody took over the operation, Ben Isaac ascertained, and you are here because you believe this somebody would be hiding on Venus, because Venus is such a haven for criminals. It was an accusation of prejudice. Not without cause, Anita noted. About a month ago, a DNA test was taken from a series of random passengers that had descended to Johannesburg from the orbital ring by cable. One of these samples triggered alarm bells in our system, as they belonged to a man that would have to be Wei Zheng's son. Your surveillance systems do not impress me, Miss Matumbu, Ben Isaac said. You make a point of traditional policing here, and so far crime has been very low. Had you done the same, you would have kept an eye on the man's son from the beginning. Except we didn't know he had a son, Anita responded triumphantly. Officially, Wei Zheng never had any children, and he had no siblings either. Even if we give the test a wide margin of error, our experts are 99% certain that the DNA sample taken comes from Wei Zheng's son. So who is it? Ben Isaac demanded. His name is Copland Hong, and he was traveling on a Venuvian passport. As far as we can tell, he emigrated here from Macau a few decades ago. We've also been able to connect him to many of Zheng's old accounts. But you found nothing illegal enough to have him arrested, the security director once again surmised. I was under the impression that the sins of the father do not become the sins of the son. He scratched his chin. I am not too familiar with Earth law. Has this changed? Anita shook her head. Of course not, but it is suspicious enough to warrant investigation. From what I can tell, and I hope you can confirm or deny this, Mr. Hong is involved with a sports league. Something local? Shukra Chase, I think? Shukra Chase, Ben Isaac corrected. He runs the league, travels to Earth to get sponsors from time to time. The security director scratched his head. Copeland Hong is a legal citizen of Venus. You have not presented any evidence that would implicate him in any crimes, and even if you had, I would only see them as valid if they were serious offenses. We believe in reformation and second chances on this planet. Maybe he came here to build a life without his father's suffocating legacy. Maybe he dabbled in becoming the old man's heir, ultimately decided against it, and was forced to flee Earth. Maybe he's been running Wei Zheng's empire for over a century right under everyone's noses, and in the process expanded it to a size that would have made his father proud, Anita countered. Francis Ben Isaac shrugged. Not impossible, but unlikely, he said, but didn't sound entirely convinced. Why should I help you? Anita forced herself not to smirk. She was prepared for this. You may think I am just one of the billions working Earth's interplanetary machine of bureaucracy, indifferent or even opposed to the independence that Venus has established for itself, and you might be right about that. But I also know who you are, Francis Ben Isaac. I know you were the first child born on Venus, and I also know that you are the son of Tatiana Ben Isaac, the founding mother of Niobe. She let the words rest for a moment. A man like Ben Isaac needed to be grabbed by his pride. I myself was born in Lagos, a city that, long before anyone ever dreamed of setting foot on Venus, had more inhabitants than this planet will have for decades to come. I never developed the same type of relationship to my home that you did, and I envy you for it. Your home means a lot to you, and you may be unwittingly harboring a dangerous criminal on it. I know that you do not like the idea of that. No agent of the law, no matter which law, would. The security director let out a long breath. He was thinking, considering, theorizing. You have no jurisdiction on Venus and no right to demand the cooperation of our law enforcement. Venus wants to remain independent, and I cannot give you what you seek, he decided. Frustration welled in Anita as her carefully constructed plan collapsed to dust. Her poker face remained. However, you are free to visit Niobe as a tourist, and stay for as long as you like. I can also tell you something off the record. Hong's house was recently broken into. 2 of the 3 suspects escaped, and justice is still in the process of being delivered. The constable who made the arrest found that Hong's domicile is quite the mansion. Too much of a mansion for a man who runs a sporting goods store. Now that I know where that wealth may ultimately be coming from, I can see a lot of things more clearly. I understand that my world has a reputation as being a safe haven for lawbreakers. We believe your laws to be too restrictive, but, as you implied, we are not a lawless people. This is the only compromise I can offer you. He looked sad, as though his hands were tied, but he couldn't hide his wariness. The security director was not convinced of what Anita had told him, but also wouldn't mount an investigation himself, be that for a lack of resources or political reasons. He wanted to use her to potentially rid himself of an actual criminal, while at the same time retaining plausible deniability. Anita was very much all right with that. She'd made arrests under less favorable conditions. Very well, Director. I shall be a tourist on your world, then. She gave him a nod of friendly professionalism. I hear the clouds are excellent this time of the year. And quite dangerous. Whether that was a threat or a warning, Anita was not sure. You should talk to Martí Mascaret, the owner of S. Barcelo. His son is the one who got arrested for breaking into Hong's domicile, and he's a Shukra Chase player who has been saying some crazy things as of late. Anita rose from her seat. Thank you for the sightseeing tip, Director, she said and extended her hand. Ben Isaac hesitated for a moment, then shook it. I hope you enjoy your stay. The plane landed smoothly at Niobe's spaceport. It was a small craft piloted by a kindly old man who greeted all of his passengers personally. Anita had never experienced an atmospheric re-entry in anything but the car of a space elevator descending from Earth's orbital ring, and she had expected the ride to be much worse. The plane taxied to a docking clamp, which generated a pressure seal so passengers could move into the terminal. In a few hours it would take on a new set of commuters, fly out to the Mars driver and be shot at the rotovator cable, which it would climb back up to Vulcan Station. The vast majority of those who had come on the Fulmine had descended on a much larger landing vehicle, directly from the sprint ship's parking position in orbit. Aside from Anita, there had only been 5 other people on the plane from Vulcan Station, and she couldn't pin a single one of them as a tourist. The spaceport was desolate save for a few waiting passengers and minimal staff. Most of the traffic from the Fulmine had apparently already been handled, and Anita was glad that she wouldn't have to elbow her way through any crowds. There was only a single scenic window through which the vast cloudscape of Venus was visible, and the area around it was littered with trefoils. The balloon keeping the spaceport afloat was located below the structure to make landings easier, which also meant that it had to be built with radiation shielding in mind. However, being a terminal for tourists, it also had to feature authentic scenery. The radiation levels were probably nowhere near dangerous, but it was an effective reminder for travelers to take some of the medication that would steel their immune systems against the additional rads they would be gaining during their stay. From a connector station that was as close to desertion as the main spaceport, Anita entered a cabled car that would take her to Niobe proper, which the spaceport was connected to by 2 parallel zip lines of ultralight carbon nanotubes. They gave off a bright red glow to inform local air traffic of their presence, and were held up every 100 meters or so by small buoys. The floor of the car was partially transparent, probably intended to give tourists the first shock of just how different life on Venus was, and it worked perfectly. Below her, clouds that looked like desert sand and candy floss formed a bright but terrifying landscape that might have been 10 or 100 kilometers away. There were no reference points, no mountain peaks piercing the cover, and all gaps only showed more clouds further down. Anita shivered, then pressed the button that would turn the floor opaque. But the damage had been done. For the following 3 kilometers, for which the cable car required 20 minutes, Anita was acutely aware that she was in a plastic box pulling itself through the sky by a rope thinner than one of her dreadlocks. All trust in the power of carbon she had cultivated over the years suddenly evaporated, and all she could do to keep panic at bay was fix her gaze on Niobe. The city, or rather town, was an assortment of various ovoid and spherical structures held together by a system of tubes, cables, and walkways. Though she knew that there was an internal logic to the construction, it was not apparent from this angle. Dozens of colossal, mushroom-shaped balloons loomed overhead, the hydrogen inside them the only reason the whole beast did not simply crash and fall to the all-consuming surface of the planet. The rays of the eternal sunrise gave Niobe an almost seraphic halo, as though this strange, irregular structure was a city inhabited by angels. When the cable car finally pulled into the station, Anita wiped sweat off her brow. That had been a truly terrifying experience. The thought of heights had never much appealed to her, and the ones she'd experienced in her life had been so high that the mind no longer registered them as such. After offloading her bags in a small, windowless hotel room that offered a great many non-Venuvian vistas in the AR to help terrified visitors sleep more easily, Anita made her way to the Paradise Concourse, which seemed to be at the very heart of the colony, and also where most of the traffic was funneled through. Most people walked on foot, but a fleet of tiny cars, barely more than seats with wheels, offered to drive her around at every opportunity. Niobe was nowhere near as claustrophobic as Anita had feared. Ceilings were kept high, and seemed to be at least partly inspired by cathedrals, though the aesthetic of flowing lines and bulbous outcroppings was the central visual feature. Stretches of vegetation appeared everywhere it was convenient, be they planter boxes of aloe vera, walls draped with ivies, or small groves of bamboo. The more she looked, the more she discovered the cultural features the inhabitants of Niobe had superimposed on the ethnically impartial decor. Colorful paisley patterns decorated carpets and draperies. Tall windows, artistically framed and double-framed, exuded an air of Gothic revivalism, and floating AR holograms featured fractal art installations. It was visible in the way people dressed, too. Though the local fashion tended to be practical, people's outfit bore a more than coincidental reminiscence to saris and achkans, most of them kept in the colors of wine, baked clay, or olives. Lustrous henna tattoos with uncommonly realistic motifs were worn by almost everyone. It was a sort of bottleneck of Indian, Iberian, and British culture that was in the process of being combined, stirred, and turned into something unique. With a not entirely fake expression of touristic sense of wonder on her face, Anita walked into Es Barceló. A translucent window popped into her vision in augmented reality, offering her the choice of 2 different AR skins. She'd been so genuinely taken with the Venuvian aesthetic that she hadn't even noticed that it defaulted to elaborate overlays only in stores. Many people chose to override how they saw the world, even in most establishments that were trying for a specific ambiance, but Anita had learned to appreciate the surprise of discovering what other people wanted her to see. There were only a handful of patrons in the breakfast diner, and none were sitting at the counter, where a short, curly-haired man who had to be Martí Mascaret was operating different pieces of culinary equipment with a sullen expression on his face. "Excuse me, mister, which of these AR skins should I choose?" she asked. It was a good way of striking up a conversation. The owner's face lit up ever so slightly. "Most people go with the standard option, but I prefer number 2. It gives the place a more authentic feeling, if you know what I mean." Anita selected number 2. The counter went from a drab grey piece of plastic and metal to a kaleidoscope of irregularly cut glass chips in different shades of blue, interrupted by wave-shaped lines of yellow at regular intervals. The walls gained organically shaped cassettes filled with stylized eucalyptus trees against a cerulean background. The green leaves glowed faintly with sunlight. They were encased by imperfect plasterwork, decorated with seashells, which stretched to form a nautilus pattern on the floor. Pearlescent shingles formed a dome on the ceiling. "Wow," she said with genuine awe. "This is really quite something. A group of architecture students in Barcelona designed it for me when I first opened the place. I've had it on for so long I don't even remember what the other skin looks like," Mascaret explained. "So what would you have for late breakfast, miss?" "Anita Mutumbu. I'm just visiting Venus to see if it is really all it is said to be. Is there a special of the day I can get?" Talking in a way that would make people tell her what she needed to know had become Anita's second nature over the years. It was easy enough. All one had to do was be friendly, show interest, and listen. Let's see. Today we have palm tomahawk with jamon serrano, anchovies, fried pickles over a hearty cheese. It's 3 slices, so you can have all 3 if you want, or any combination. Also a small glass of horchata, café con leche, and 3 pieces of toro blau, which I am very proud to say is an invention of my own that has since penetrated Earth cuisine. "Sounds like something I ought to try," Anita said, and Mascaret got to work. "Why don't you make this the default skin?" she suggested, making a gesture that encompassed the entire room. Mascaret shrugged. "I've considered it, but there must be a reason why people prefer the default, no? Maybe it's because it is the default, and they would like this one more if it wasn't presented merely as an alternative skin in the context menu," Anita suggested. The cook gave a and tapped commands into the coffee machine. "This is actually not a terrible assessment. Knowing about people is what I do," she responded, smiling. A few moments later, Mascaret set down a tray, virtually inlaid with a spiral of orange and pine green tiles, in front of her. On it were 3 slices of toasted baguette bread, dripping with olive oil. Tomato had been rubbed into them. One slice came with cured ham, another with anchovies and fried pickles, and the third had a thick slice of cheese on it. There was a glass of what looked like cinnamon milk, but had a strange, earthy but refreshing taste to it, and a good cup of coffee with milk. Toro blau turned out to be dice-shaped pieces of a soft blue paste that tasted mostly of almonds and peanuts, though Anita discovered a well-covered hint of algae flavor characteristic of blue magic, which was a strain of spirulina popular with spacefarers in general. "I must apologize for my manners earlier. I didn't even give you my name. I am Martí Mascaret, owner and proprietor of this place. It is no excuse, but my mind is preoccupied with many things these days." "It is no problem, Martí. Life on Venus must be difficult, or so I would imagine. No need to be hard on yourself. Anita assuaged. No, it is not life on Venus. I love it here, best place I ever lived. In the last 30 years, I only got homesick once, which is when I ordered this AR skin. There was a smile on his face now. It's just, I shouldn't bother you with it, really. It's a personal matter, and you're a guest here and all that. If you are comfortable with it, do explain. I've been known to bring good insights and ideas into people's lives. She pointed around the room and smiled. It was half a joke, but her suggestion to make this the default AR skin earlier also made it half true in Masquerade's mind. He seemed to consider that for a moment, then pulled his chair over to sit down on the other side of the counter from her. It is my son. I love him very much, but he has been imprisoned. Anita acted shocked. Was he falsely imprisoned? Masquerade shook his head. No, he did what they say he did. Broke into a man's home, even went to great effort for it, because it is not connected to the main structure. Terrible thing that. Never happened before. Why did he do it? Anita asked, giving off the impression that she was not willing to condemn the boy just yet. Well, this requires some explaining. There is a sport here on Venus called Shukra Chase. You may have heard of it, you may not. My boy, Yook, is a great player, and his team are also very good. Ron Bateman, my very good friend, was the coach. He is also Yook's godfather. They have all been banned from playing because the man whose house they broke into was the organizer of the league. Masquerade explained. That does not constitute much of a reason for trespassing, Anita noted. Masquerade shook his head. It is some conspiracy theory. Adam explained it to me, so did Yook. They say that there was a difference in the AR projection that Yook saw versus the AR projection of what everybody else saw, and that is why he missed the ball, we call it Comet, on his last game. Sounds like a glitch. Why didn't they take it up with the organizer directly? Anita asked. Hong can be difficult to deal with. Apparently he was very deflective, which only fueled their suspicion. Bingo! That was the connection. What had existed in her mind only as a hunch had now become something tangible. A lead. A path that smelled fishy. I can certainly understand your boy's reasoning then. Anita empathized. It is not easy going up against unfair power structures. Yes, and I can't help but believe him a little bit. But that is only because he is my son. He's been in prison for a month now, and they allow him to continue his university studies. But when Hong returns from Earth, there will be a trial, and there will be a conviction. I am sure of it. Marty Masquerade seemed utterly defeated. Do you know what we do with convicted prisoners on Venus? Anita shook her head. In truth, she did know. We sell them. We cannot afford prison space, so the few criminals that we do have we send to minor crews, where they must work off their sentence. The money they earn goes toward the colony, and they return with valuable skills to be reintegrated into society. There were tears in the man's eyes now. My son could get 10 years for this. I do not want him working on some ice miner for 10 years. The radiation exposure alone. He shivered. I am certain it will not be that long, especially if your son is a bright young man with many talents. Judges tend to be lenient in such cases. I am not an expert of Venus law, but I think you will do a year, maybe 2 at most. And mining ships are usually very well insulated against radiation. Anita felt sorry for the man. She'd met many like him, concerned parents who knew their children were criminals but could not quite believe it. There had been a time where she'd considered this paternal love to be weakness, but she'd come around to seeing that it could be a miracle catalyst in the rehabilitation process. She remembered a case she had worked in her early days, stumbled into, really, back on Earth. There had been a killer going around the pontoon islands on the Lagos Lagoon. Anita barely remembered his face or that of any of his 7 victims, but his mother, looking out onto the light rain splashing into the green water outside her living room window, she would never forget. Her son had done unspeakable things, and all she could think about was how he would be treated in prison. She couldn't stand the thought of her little boy alone with all the criminals. Of course, these two situations were hardly comparable in magnitude. How do you know these things? Or are you just trying to make me feel better? Martí Mascaret asked. I have some legal expertise, yes, she smiled. But what matters is that you do feel better. There is no point in wallowing. Your son will need your strength, and I believe that you have it in you to help him. It was almost entirely not a lie. A meal and a little research later, her next stop was the historic old town of Niobe, to the medical practice of Dr. Ronald Bateman. Having gotten the name and connection that Martí Mascaret had given her, she'd gained the clue that she was looking for. However, finding things out about Bateman had been difficult even with the resources she had at her disposal. He'd been born in Omaha, Nebraska, and grown up an ace student and decorated athlete. Afterwards, he had attended the Montreal University for Medical Science for 10 years, and worked as a geneticist and pediatrician at Johns Hopkins Medical Center for a while, before entering a career in genetic treatment. This period of his life was particularly hazy, but it appeared as though he had bounced from project to project, playing a key role in many of them and receiving several awards and accolades. Finally, Bateman had been tapped to develop and oversee the administration of genetic adaptations for a team of scientists that were to deploy to a permanent station on Venus. Instead of leaving it at that, he'd gone with them, disappearing into the blind spot that would become Venuvian data protection law. Aside from his professional career, there was nothing. No private information, only a handful of addresses, no correspondence, no personality profiles, not even more than a handful of pictures. She knew people like that, and they were mostly criminals. But Ronald Bateman had never even been flagged for anything. The entrance to his practice was located in a round room with a ceiling at the uncomfortably low height of 2 meters. It was the very first living module deployed to Venus, still the second largest individual module after the Paradise Concourse, and originally designed for complete self-sufficiency at low resource cost. Nothing in here was intended to be visually appealing. Everything was metal, plastic, and rectilinear pragmatism. According to information on the internet, its original infrastructure had been completely gutted. The hydroponic gardens had been turned into a small park, the mess hall had been converted into a gym, and even the original fusion reactor had been switched off to become the centerpiece of a museum displaying history that many people still alive had been a part of. Bateman's practice, formerly the medical center, was one of the few things that remained. When Anita entered, she noticed that the auto-secretary was not just an AR projection, but an actual hologram of a young woman sitting in a glass cubicle. Very old school. "Welcome," she said enthusiastically. "How can I help you today, ma'am?" "I'd like to see Dr. Bateman," Anita responded. "Could you describe some of your basic symptoms?" "I am not feeling too well." She preferred to keep it cryptic for the auto-secretary. The computer was probably not as bound by doctor-patient confidentiality as Bateman. "You'll have to be a little more specific than that," a man's booming voice said. Ronald Bateman had entered the room without so much as making a sound. "Hi, I'm the doctor. Do come in." He extended a hand, smiling. Anita found his age hard to judge. He must have been at least 100 years old, but he looked barely 40, with no signs of having undergone age reversal therapies. "Is there no one else waiting?" Bateman shook his head. "All the old-timers are half MDs themselves, and I'm not the only doctor in town anymore, thank God for that." He led her into an elegant office without any AR elements. It was decorated in the dark wood and galvanized metal style that had been popular in North America quite some time ago, all straight angles and simple, geometric decorations. The floor was real black carpet,
and in the back wall there was a gigantic digital aquarium where fictional species of fish swam across a landscape of red rock. Bateman offered her a seat that was decidedly uncomfortable and reclined into his own identical chair as though it were made of memory gel.
Tell me, where does it hurt?
Are you not going to ask my name? Anita inquired.
Ah, a tourist. I figured as much. I've never seen you here before.
He smiled.
Yes, I make a point of not asking patient names if they don't want to disclose them. Of course, I know all of their names because Venus is so small, but we value our anonymity here. Also, everybody just kind of tells me their name. It's the trust of tight-knit communities.
Anita nodded. I've always been a city person, so I never experienced that kind of thing. Maybe it's a primal instinct, but I sometimes find myself missing it.
So settle down here. There's a major expansion project coming up in a few years, and we still need people to fill it, Bateman jokingly offered.
For that to happen, you would have to help me first. Anita had honed in on her approach vector. Every time I think about the outside, about the fact that we are suspended in the clouds by hydrogen, which by all means should be flammable in any other atmosphere, it just makes me... She shivered. It was plausible enough as a reason to initiate a trustful conversation with the doctor, and also was true.
Well, we do have a psychotherapist now. She's over in the mall, moved in 4 or 5 years ago. She might be better suited for your needs, said Bateman.
Shit. Apparently Bateman was not a believer in the idea common among physicians that simply talking about a medical issue could lessen the severity of some of its symptoms. I am not sure my insurance covers anything but a general practitioner out here on Venus, Anita lied.
Must be a uniquely terrible insurer then, said Bateman.
And also, the man who runs the breakfast diner recommended you. I don't remember his name, but he is very nice. Shame about his son, I have to say.
Are you some kind of reporter? 'Cause you sure as heck aren't sick.
The jig was up. Bateman was a lot more perceptive than Masquerade, it seemed. Anita relaxed. In the past, she would have felt a slight panic when a charade was stripped away like this, but these days it was simply one less thing to worry about in a high-stakes negotiation. I am not a reporter. I am a Slecker agent from Bowman Station. Bateman gave her no reaction. Francis Ben Isaac knows I am here, she added when his hand moved to the communications pad on his desk. And he knows who I am. He has allowed this investigation. I can assure you that I mean neither you nor the people of Venus any harm. In fact, I am trying to protect you. What can you tell me about Copeland Hong and the Shukra Chase League?
Marti is one of the most lovable people you'll ever meet, but he's just too naive. Back when he wanted Yook, he asked me how the woman who would be the genetic mother of his son felt that she would have a child grown in an artificial womb on Venus, said Bateman. He had no idea that the woman's genes were procedurally generated and that she didn't really exist. I don't know what he's told you, but I'll bite. Copeland Hong came here with a third wave of colonists, hired by the government as an accountant. He was basically our local version of the IRS, which is an agency from, Pete, a long time ago. The doctor scratched his beard. He eventually became increasingly engrossed with our athletics scene. And when we opened the concourse, he got some prime real estate in there and began running a sporting goods shop. He was especially fascinated by Shukra Chase, but who here isn't, so that's what he set his sights on. For years now, he's been working on a league that is broadcast through the entire system. And there's been something fishy going on in there, has it not? Anita asked. Bateman shook his head. If you believe Yook's conspiracy theory, which I want to but can't, it smells fishy. To me, the fact that there was such an egregious glitch smells half-baked, sure, but nothing more. Even if I told you that Copeland Hong is the son of a notorious bookmaker, that fixed, and this number is not an exaggeration, over 10,000 games. Anita smirked. This was new to him, and it struck home.
Is he? Bateman raised an eyebrow. Prove it.
I most certainly can. She prepared a query to the Slecker archives on Borman Station, requesting the full paternity test proving Copeland Hong to be the son of Wei Zheng, but then considered otherwise. Actually, I could have them send over Wei Zheng's sequenced genome, and you could perform a paternity test yourself.
Would that I could, but no, that won't be possible.
Bateman grinned at some private joke that only he was in on.
Copeland Hong is one of the few people on this planet that have refused genetic analysis and treatment in my clinic. I was always sure he had his reasons. Turns out those may have been less than kosher.
And then the full paternity test will arrive here in about 20 minutes, Anita said, projecting a screenshot of the transmission into the local AR. So are you willing to help me? It was a question, but also a factual statement that would cement the notion in Bateman's mind, if he hadn't already made it up.
Bateman nodded. There is a condition.
Yes, I will let you handle things the Venuvian way, Anita conceded.
That's not what I mean.
He leaned forward and placed his elbows on the table.
If you're any good, and by Pete I hope you are, you will have also looked into me, and you will have found a certain lack of substance there.
So what if I had?
Don't look into it. You wouldn't want to.
Is that a threat? Anita squinted. She did not like being threatened.
Let me rephrase that. Maybe you would want to look into me, but your bosses' would not like you to look into me, he elaborated. Which is also a fact that should stay between us, unless you want to find yourself disappeared by interests more powerful than the both of us.
If you are what you say you are, why are you doing this at all? Anita asked, out of curiosity alone. His reasons did not matter, so long as he helped her get to the bottom of this.
I care about Venus, I care about Niobe, and I care about Shukra Chase. But most of all, I care about Yook and the other kids in his team. He's my godson, and I'm their coach. I want what's best for them, and I want what's best for this colony.
How endearing. A noble spy, said Anita.
You don't know the half of it.
Bateman leaned back into his chair again, grinning.
So, now that we're a team, where would you like to start?
Why did Yook Masquerade break into Copeland Hong's domicile? Simpler, less dangerous acts of revenge could have been performed.
Yook wasn't after revenge. He's not that kind of person. I don't know what he wanted, but I know of a way we can find out.
How do you propose that? Anita wanted to know.
We ask him.
Bateman shrugged.
I hope you didn't lie earlier when you said Francis Ben Isaac is aware of your investigation, because I'm about to ask him for a favor.
He knows about it, but he did not grant me the support I needed, Anita admitted, shifting in her chair.
Don't worry about that. Francis and I go way back.
Bateman made the hand motions of someone dialing up a line in augmented reality.
Do you have any experience being a legal counsel?
Anita shook her head. They were usually on the other side of things.
Doesn't matter. You'll only be pretending for the police anyway.
Jail was a terrible place, but Yook had to admit that it was doing wonders for his education. There was nothing to do in his 3x5-meter cell except stare at the white walls, and those got boring quickly. The entertainment and communication programs of his AR had been deactivated, but the judge had decided that he would have full access to learning and information software, provided and approved of by Oxford Remote. If he needed access to anything not on the list for the purposes of academic research, he had to put in a request, which so far had always been approved in a matter of hours. The jail had 3 other inmates at this time, but Yook was not allowed to see them. Too dangerous, the police warden said. Apparently they were proper criminals. But Yook had a right to socialize, and was thus allowed 3 hours a day to talk to whatever visitors came by to see him. His father was there almost every time, Nina and Adam almost every other. Bateman also visited at least once a week, sometimes twice. Nobody else from the Cloud Vikings came by, and Adam told him that they blamed Yook for getting the team banned. They couldn't talk about the heist, of course, as the police was always listening. In the beginning, talking to his father had been the most difficult, which was ironic, considering that Martí Mascarell was the most forgiving of the people he talked to. Nina would have joined the team in their united front against him for having been dragged into this mess in the first place, were it not the case that she had been ostracized from the team first. Adam was firmly on Yook's side, but couldn't help bearing at least minimal resentment in spite of knowing better. He would never admit it, as that would be evidence of human fallibility. At first, Yook had found it impossible to even look Martí in the eyes from the shame. But his father was quick to make clear that, while he did not approve of Yook's actions, he was not angry with him. The hug that followed was the most safe and comforted Yook had felt since childhood, and it gave him something to hold on to when fear overwhelmed him in his cell. He did not want to go on an ice miner. It was unfair that a trial would only be conducted when Hong returned. Even in the unlikely case that the verdict was not guilty, Yook would have spent half a year in jail. Hong had refused all requests to cut his stay on Earth short, and the judge had seen no reason to force his return. Then again, if he would serve prison time, it would be half a year less aboard an ice miner. Yook was reading a dissertation on the Stamets technique when his door slid open unexpectedly. "Your counsel wants a word," said the police warden. "Riera was here just yesterday," Yook responded, not protesting the chance to go and talk to someone. "It's not Riera, it's your other counsel." The warden was clearly not amused. He beckoned Yook out of the cell and led him through a series of narrow corridors to one of the secure rooms reserved for lawyer-client conversations. Bateman was waiting in front of it and gave Yook a wink. Before he could respond, the warden shoved him into the room and closed the door. Sitting at the table was a broad-shouldered African woman with dreadlocks and the slightly off-kilter posture of a tourist. She smiled at him, but her eyes remained distant and analytical. "What's going on here?" Yook asked. "Relax. Sit down. I am here because I can help you get out of the mess you got yourself in." "You're an off-worlder, but you're here with Bateman," said Yook, stating the obvious. "Why are you my legal counsel now?" "A document Security Director Ben Isaac probably had every legal right to sign. There is no law specifying the amount of lawyers a defendant can have on Venus. But really this is about you being able to tell me information without incriminating yourself," the woman explained. "Why should I tell you anything?" Yook demanded. He didn't like her already. "You're not even from Venus." She gave a frustrated sigh. "I am after Copeland Hong. Things may be looking better for you than you think, but I can't tell you more than that. The police will most likely interrogate you after this, and I cannot afford information slipping out." The off-worlder tapped on the table a few times. "What did you take from Copeland Hong's domicile?" Yook's mind was making sums. What if this was some sort of trick by Hong to get an admission of guilt out of him? He was the only person he knew with friends off Venus, and the time frame would have been sufficient for him to recruit and send someone. But then why was Bateman involved? It was hard to believe that his godfather of all people would betray him like this. But what if he, too, had been fooled? He imagined throwing a coin. It was a trick that Bateman had taught him back when he was a little boy, running up and down the aisles of Es Barceló with a wingsuit glider figurine his father had printed for him. The layer of abstraction allowed him to reach a decision without actually having to reach a decision.
The outcome of the coin toss was not random, but representative of what his subconscious would want him to do. We copied the AR software. Nina has it now. She's studying it, he said, still not entirely certain that he was doing the smart thing. The off-worlder nodded. She seemed immediately more at ease. What did she find? Yook paused. Should he reveal that he had found a way of secretly communicating with Nina over the Oxford remote portal? If this was a trick, it would potentially get him into deep trouble. But in for a penny, in for a pound, as the old saying he had never quite understood went. There is something that shouldn't be there. A deeper layer to the software. That's really all I know, he admitted. Nina knows more. And this is Nina Singh, yes? The woman asked. Yook nodded. Thank you, Yook, she said, her smile now more genuine than before. You've just helped the both of us. She rose and unceremoniously walked toward the door without even shaking his hand. Wait, said Yook. The woman stopped. You're not Venuvian. She won't talk to you. She's one of those people, is she? Yes, we're all one of those people, Yook snapped. I'll send her a message, tell her to contact you, he added. Don't expect her to trust you, but this way she'll at least talk. The off-worlder nodded. You're doing the right thing. Anything they ask you about this conversation, you do not have to answer. I know. Had she gone too hard on the boy? It wasn't like he was to blame for the fact that she was decidedly uncomfortable, doing something the legality of which she wasn't all too certain about, even if it was part of an ongoing investigation. Bending the rules in certain situations was necessary, but this was the type of thing that could get one fired from any law enforcement agency. But even Frances Ben Isaac had assured her that she was now a fully certified legal counsel on Venus, a position for which there were apparently no regulations whatsoever. Still, she should not have let her own insecurity hit Yook Mascaret the way it almost certainly had. The young man had oscillated between anxiety and irritation, and Anita had later become keenly aware of the fact that she hadn't even told him her name. She'd had enough time to ponder it later, when she was passing the time until Nina Singh decided to contact her. It was clear that Yook Mascaret had done wrong, but the label criminal somehow did not mix with the picture she had of the boy, sitting there in the interrogation room, terrified but trying to play the stoic. Copeland Hong was willing to use his own absence to make the process the punishment, and that made him a valid target for her as much as his potential involvement as Wei Zheng's heir, if not more so. The law was a shield, not a sword, as frustrating as that was sometimes. Anita had resolved to go to sleep when she received a message from Nina Singh. The lack of a proper night in the daily experience of the inhabitants of Venus made calling an establishment a nightclub difficult. According to Bateman, this place was simply called The Club, because it was the only one on Venus at this point in time. It was an independently suspended structure, connected to the main complex of Niobe via skybridge outfitted with vibration dampeners, and reminded Anita of a cocktail bar more than a club. There was a large dance floor in the center of the round hall. Surrounding it was an elevated area filled with a convoluted system of booths and compartments. There were 2 bars on opposite ends of the club. One of them was manned by a bored-looking woman, while in the other a service android was waiting for instructions. It looked about as human as a tennis ball looked like a lemon, and Anita wondered if the machine even qualified as an android at all. Despite it being late in the clock-defined evening, there were only few patrons. It was a natural development for colonies and habitats with no regular day-night cycle. Most of them tried to maintain an official time zone for a while, but eventually neighbors would drift with their habits and needs, until one day they lived on entirely different circadian rhythms.
Venus seemed to be no exception to this, with the older generations clinging to a common time to wake up and go to sleep out of habit, and the young never having experienced anything but a constant sunrise. Anita couldn't begin to guess when this club had its busiest hours. Back on Borman Station in her first apartment, she had usually gone to bed at around 0700 station time, at the end of the first shift, which had been just as busy as all other shifts. Incidentally, this had also been the time at which the bar on the opposite end of her street had set its happy hour. Needless to say, Anita had moved apartments after a few months. Down in the dancing pit, groups of young people spun, twirled, and jerked to entirely different rhythms, while the club was eerily silent. According to an info panel floating in the AR, there were currently 7 auto DJs playing different genres, and live music would begin at what Niobe time had arbitrarily defined as midnight. Until then, revelers would move their bodies to tunes transmitted directly to their earplugs. When she spotted Nina Singh sitting in a booth near the robot's bar, Anita was taken aback for a moment. The young woman was lounging in a huge armchair, looking at the dance floor, wearing a cream-colored plastic overall that fit her skin so tightly it left nothing to the imagination. She took a closer look at the other patrons, and noted that they were dressed in a similar fashion, only in colors that wouldn't easily be mistaken for skin. Some wore long, heavy coats over their skin-tight attire, which they incorporated into their dancing. There seemed to be nothing sexual or even erotic about this. Yes, there was always the air of courtship and flirtation, but that was the standard baseline Anita remembered from her own clubbing days, and had nothing to do with the revealing apparel. "You're wearing city clothes," Nina Singh snapped when Anita sat down in front of her. "This is not the city. This is the club." "I apologize, but I am merely a tourist here." Anita raised her hands defensively. "Sure, a tourist." The girl laughed. "And I'm a surfacer, risen on a balloon to snatch your kids away when they play near the airlock." Anita ignored the comment and waited for Singh to continue. Young women were especially susceptible to the power of stoicism. "If Yook hadn't begged me to meet you, I would have spat at your feet if I ever saw you on the streets," said Singh, giving Anita a disgusted look. "What's with the attitude? I have done you no harm." "It's not about you, it's about what you are. Yook may not know what that is, but I figured it out in an instant." Singh had a triumphant look on her face. "You're foreign law enforcement, Slecker, probably. Your being here betrays everything Venus stands for." "Why meet me in public then?" Anita asked. "This place is hardly anonymous. All of your friends can see that you are talking to me." "Because this is the club. What's so difficult to understand about that?" There was frustration in the girl's voice, as though she were explaining something painfully simple to a child refusing to understand it. "It's not the city, it's a different place. When you come here, who you are no longer matters. And when you leave, what you did here and who you talked to may as well never happened. Nothing is recorded. It's the most anonymous place on Venus." Anita shrugged. She was no anthropologist, but a tradition like this developing inside a habitat where everyone was so closely packed and had little room for privacy did not surprise her. A drone arrived and set off a tablet with 2 whiskey glasses on it. The drink inside them was opaque and the color of butter with dark brown swirls in it. Nina Singh took one for herself and slid the other over to Anita. It smelled faintly of chocolate milk. The girl didn't wait to clink glasses and took a deep swallow of her drink, inviting Anita to do the same. Taking even a small sip, it required all of her discipline not to spit it out across the table. Years of working as a cop had made her jaded to a great many disgusting things, but swallowing this was on a whole new level. "Tastes like ammonia," she croaked. Nina Singh grinned sardonically. "The taste of Venus,"
she said, as though that somehow made it good.
If you don't like it, you really are an outsider.
I thought we'd already established that, Anita asked. She knew that power games like this were normal for a confident young woman like Nina Singh, but all she saw right now was an insolent little girl, and she was losing her patience. I am the outsider who is the only person that will help you get your friends out of prison. That one seemed to have hit the mark. Spite replaced arrogance on Singh's face.
What do you want from me, then? She asked.
You know exactly what I want from you, Anita responded. You have the Shukra Chase AR software, and Yook tells me you have found something coming to it.
There is something in the source code, all right. I have no idea what it is, but it is complex.
Singh almost emptied her drink in one drag, and, for a moment, Anita saw the disgust on her face. She wasn't quite as fond of the local delicacy as she had proclaimed to be, it appeared. Then again, that was the thing with local delicacies. They were local because they weren't good enough to make it anywhere else.
There is a fairly large and sophisticated software that handles the augmented reality for the player's retinal implants separately from the rest. It can analyze the state of the game in ways I couldn't possibly comprehend without commented code. I'm certain it can make modifications to what a player sees.
As you would expect, if it is meant to accurately recreate the augmented reality the rest of the perspectives see, Anita noted.
Nina Singh nodded. Sure, but this is different. It's like the entirety of the software is just copied into there and run as a simulation, which has several places for input. The simulation and the original AR projection both get sent through a whole host of analysis routines, some of which I believe can start simulations of their own. The end result is what the player sees. But all of that could have been done without the extra code.
Could this have any non-malicious applications? Anita asked. She was getting somewhere, but she couldn't press the girl, lest she act unpredictably.
On any other day, without comments telling me what the code does, I would call this monumentally shoddy programming, Nina Singh explained. But the software is too complex for it to have been programmed by an idiot, and it runs too well. It's expertly coded, very efficient. So this huge amount of code, which does nothing that could not be handled much more simplistically, can't be an accident, especially considering that it probably eats more than half of the processing power required to run this whole beast.
Is this software a method of manipulating matches in a way that would allow them to be regulated to increase the chances of a certain result being achieved? Anita asked. In other words, is this made for rigging games by forcing players to make mistakes?
Without comments, there's no way to tell.
The girl shook her head.
Nobody could, even if compiled, and I have successfully recompiled it. The software is almost impossible to operate without knowing what it does. I know what it does, and that's enough.
But it isn't. If it's open to interpretation, it is too weak for a court of law.
An Earth court, maybe.
The arrogant smirk returned to Nina Singh's lips.
But here on Venus, we handle things differently. Here we do justice, not tyrannical bureaucracy.
She moved to rise from the armchair. Give me a copy of the source code. I can have it investigated by the solar system's most elite specialists in computer forensics, Anita offered.
Nina Singh puffed. In your dreams, slacker. I'm not going to help you. I will never help Earth, even if it pretends to be my ally. Before Anita could respond, she stormed off.
Ah, the arrogance of youth. Absolutely no sense in their heads. The investigation had stalled. She'd lost her lead, but Anita was not willing to give up. A walk was what she needed to clear her head and gain some perspective. She entered a remote arcade accessible through a narrow tunnel between a 3D printing shop and the education center. It faced the night side of Niobe, the cloud banks disappearing in the not-so-distant darkness.
The windows between the arches were made of triple-layered security perspex, but they were clear enough to make her feel like she was standing at the shore of a vast alien ocean. The spot was marked on several maps as a soothing area for tourists who were disturbed by the very problem she was having, but who also wanted to ease themselves into accepting being above the clouds. The effects were so immediate that Anita half thought there was some psychoactive gas in the air. She could almost hear the waves splashing against the sandy beach just out of her sight. Having been blown off by Nina Singh was a problem, and potentially one that she would be unable to deal with. She needed to think of an alternate way to gain access to the full source code without violating Venuvian law or forcing the cooperation of local police. The best way to come up with ideas when stuck, she found, was to not think about the case for a few hours and immerse oneself in a mixture of new and familiar stimuli. It would give her the ability to step back and get a bird's-eye view of what she was dealing with, and her subconscious would rattle through what she knew and didn't know in order to provide some new perspective. In her experience, a new approach to the problem would manifest itself eventually, provided there was one. It was one of those things they didn't teach you at the police academy. Anita sat, listening to music, reading some of her favored internet publications. A virtual newspaper appeared in front of her, right underneath the small pod that was her music player, providing a customized selection of articles. A major base of operations of the Marineris guerrillas had been found and raided by security forces, though which of the many factions operating in the area it belonged to was as yet unclear. One paper cited insider sources saying it was the New Reds, which the communists had already denied. Another paper cited insider sources saying it was the Order of Ming Ming, which denied being a part of the war entirely. The sprint ship Confianza had delivered 3,000 colonists to Ceres, most of whom would strike out to make their fortunes in other parts of the asteroid belt. Videos of elated crowds played without sound. Arthur Putnam Tupper had been diagnosed with a rare form of incurable cancer. That one came as a shock. The Traveller, as he was commonly known, had always seemed like an indestructible folk hero, a mythical figure facing the darkness of space, imbued with the power of human ingenuity. He'd been to Venus in its early days, worked alongside Tatiana Ben Isaac. Maybe Francis Ben Isaac had even met him as a little boy. It was ironic that, of all people, the avatar of technological progress would be afflicted with a disease that was all but eradicated. Just as she was about to delve into an article from a local Lagos newspaper, some chord from an electric guitar playing a slow riff over a traditional Yoruba drum beat pulled something to the forefront of her mind. The third burglar. Of course! How could she have been so blind? Just when she was about to send a message to Ronald Bateman announcing that she would be coming by, she received a message from him. "I found something that will interest you," the message said. "DNA grafting?" she asked. "What do you think gene therapy is if not DNA grafting?" Bateman asked. "Sure, but DNA tests to confirm identity are taken from at least 6 different sources of cells. So if someone has genetically modified skin, only the skin cells should be modified, which would show up as a discrepancy." Anita pointed at the screens of the machine running the genome analysis. All of Copeland Hong's DNA samples are identical. And yet we see the hallmarks of retrovirally introduced genetic code everywhere in his genome. It's a complicated and frankly unnecessary process, especially for someone who has few obvious genetic modifications, Bateman explained. "What does this mean?" Anita asked. "It means that, most likely, Copeland Hong is none other than his own father, Wei Zhang. He had his entire genome universally altered," Bateman said. "How?" Anita demanded. Longevity treatments weren't even invented when Wei Zheng died, not to mention the technology for gene therapy on this scale.
Bateman shrugged. Maybe they put him on ice or something. He need a lot of brain power to do what this guy did. Going to prison must have been something he had a contingency for. I personally know a lot of guys who would spill trade secrets to test out some of their more experimental treatments for the right amount of cash. Shadow science is a huge thing these days, and it probably always has been.
Anita gritted her teeth. This case was getting more absurd by the minute. Can we prove that Copeland Hong is actually Wei Zheng in a court of law? She asked.
I'm not a lawyer, but I'm 99% sure that it's not an admissible standard of evidence, Bateman responded. He sat down in his office chair. There are several reasons for why these same anomalies would appear in a person's DNA. It's the circumstantial evidence that brings me to the conclusion that this is not the case.
She searched her mind for any cases like this she might have worked or heard of, but came up blank. The fact that she'd been unaware of complete genome grafting suddenly presented a lot of her old cases in a different light. How many relatives of suspects had she interviewed that were actually the killers she had been looking for all along? What about germline? She heard herself say. Ronald Bateman's eyes widened.
Holy heck, I did not consider that.
He jumped from his chair, worked over to a painting slideshow, and typed on a series of private AR elements. He needed a few moments, apparently reading, before he gave a surprised grunt and threw a series of windows into the shared AR. I do not want a lecture, Anita warned before he could start, but Bateman shook his head.
So here's the deal. Because of the cultural sensitivities on the sacrilege of altering the DNA of one's sperm and ovocytes, germline gene therapy is highly illegal in the vast majority of countries. We play around with the zygote's DNA to our liking, even if it's in the mother's womb if natural birth is your thing, but there's something about permanently altering the seed from which life itself springs that triggers some primal revulsion in people. An image appeared of what Anita identified as chromosome pairs, except one half of the pair was grayed out. Now, you might say that criminals don't care about whether or not something is illegal, but the widespread ban on germline gene therapy and research also means that there is next to no money being poured into that particular field of the genetic sciences. Because sperm cells are haploid and only carry half of a person's genome, a treatment that might work for a cell with a full set of nuclear DNA might not work for a reproductive cell. So instead of messing up the DNA of everyone's children, when you do a full genetic conversion, you keep the sperm cells the same. Meaning that Copeland Hong should still be producing the sperm of Wei Zheng, Anita concluded. Absolutely not, said Francis Ben Isaac.
An AR projection of him was sitting off to the side, talking to both Anita and Dr. Bateman. The law is clear on this. No computer or recording device a person owns that is located inside their household can be used against them in court unless the crime in question is one of bodily or mental harm or involves the transaction of at least half the yearly income of the average Venusian, he quoted, presumably reading off a legal text. Is an android really a device, though? Anita asked. It's a living being, really. Even if I were to accept that dubious interpretation, a member of a suspect's household cannot be compelled to give evidence against a suspect. Seeing as this android is property of Copeland Hong, you should assume that it will not volunteer to sell out the person it is programmed to remain loyal to.
Strictly speaking, we wouldn't be forcing her to talk in court. We just need residual sperm from whatever milking device she has where the vagina would ordinarily be, Bateman noted.
And this is only assuming we find something at all. Depending on how she is built, and the last time Hong ejaculated inside her, there might be no viable DNA left, not to mention her hygiene routines, Anita added, implying that time was running out. She withheld the fact that it was probably not impossible to find sequenceable sperm DNA somewhere in a bachelor's household, but that right to privacy was even more sacred on Venus. I would be more inclined to make an exception if this was a domestic investigation. Instead, we have a foreign power searching for evidence to arrest a citizen of Venus, currently in their jurisdiction. Ben Isaac's face was a mask of cold iron. He didn't even look at Anita as he spoke. "You're the one who let her in here," Bateman noted, "and also made her a verified legal counsel. In my professional opinion, Wei Zheng and Copeland Hong are the same person, and Wei Zheng is demonstrably not the type of person we want on this planet. I just need the sperm to make the case airtight." "This is the one time where cooperating with the rest of us will save you a great deal of trouble, Director," said Anita. "You are witnessing a man committing a crime that will sully something everybody on your colony loves, and you are letting him get away with it." "Even if Hong isn't who he says he is, that changes nothing. There is no proof that the anomaly in the AR software isn't just a bug. You don't even have the source code. We must assume the best of intentions. That is the way of Venus." "Director, this isn't a carty for some other petty criminal. This is a man involved in large-scale organized crime, and he will plant the seed of that here," Anita insisted. This sanctimonious obstructionism was getting on her nerves. To assume the best in a man with a past like this would be foolish and naive, not to mention dangerous.
"Come on, Frank, drop the act." Bateman sounded like he was at the end of his patience as well. "You read the reports of that mansion he lives in. The guy clearly has a lot more money than he should, and he made that money in very dark ways. He has the only sex android, probably the only lifelike android period on the entire planet, and it's custom built. There are spaceships cheaper than one of those." "I'm not denying that he used to be a criminal. I am merely suggesting that he isn't one anymore." Francis Ben Isaac was beginning to sound defensive. "To me, this is your biased mind siding with a foreign power in order to protect your godchild, Ron. I have empathy for that, but I will not heed your counsel if it turns you into an Earth Law apologist. If I give you evidence that something criminal might be going on right now, with Copeland Hong's involvement, would you allow us to investigate his android?" Anita asked. "If it is solid evidence, I would," Francis Ben Isaac responded, nodding. "But it would have to be good evidence. I'm not an unreasonable man." After Bateman had cut the feed, he turned to Anita and frowned. "You have some evidence you didn't tell me about?" "Not yet, but you will help me get it," she responded. "The third person involved. You know who it is. It fell out of my head, but they must have some way of getting the source code. You neglected to tell me about them, but that is understandable considering your biases." "I didn't even tell you about Nina. That was Yook. As much as I want to help you, I also don't want to place anyone else I care about in the line of fire."
Bateman tapped his fingers on the desk. "There's eyes on you now. If I set up a meet between you and the driver, the suspicion will fall on them. Everybody already knows Nina only got away because of her father's position as chief of maintenance. I'm afraid the driver would not enjoy such privileges, which is exactly why nobody has any idea who it was." Anita was certain that a lot of the locals did know, but they would not talk to her about it. "Schedule an appointment. Make use of doctor-patient confidentiality. You know I don't care about him or his crimes. I care only about the source code."
An hour later, Adam Mundy was sitting in the office with them.
"I am assuming she's not some kind of specialist doctor," he joked half-heartedly, unable to hide his nervousness. "I assumed your friend Nina would have told you about me already," Anita noted. "More like warned. I have to say, Coach, I did not expect you to be working with a foreign cop. I always believed you to be a patriot, but apparently my human brain was mistaken. The young man flailed his arms about like a conductor as he spoke. You're an idealist, Adam, and I admire that about you. But idealism is not a good way to protect one's ideals. It sounds ironic, I know, but that's the way it is. Bateman had the cadence of a lecturing uncle. No, it's not, Mundy decided. You're the one working with a foreign agent, while I am not. My integrity remains uncompromised. You are playing into the hands of a woman who does not care about Venus, and thus acting as someone who does not care about Venus would. But that's what you don't understand, Bateman started, before Anita interrupted him. You're right, I do not care about Venus. Over the years, many of my colleagues have found it to be the final barrier in their way to deliver justice to dangerous criminals, she explained. Every time that happens, the diplomatic pressure on Venus grows. Wei Zheng is the worst criminal your world has harbored yet. If you hinder the law in concluding its investigation, you will not only risk having your sovereign status violated by powers that could do it, but have decided not to up to this point, but you will have one of your most important cultural traits forever tainted, possibly even destroyed. Anita leaned a little closer and fixed Mundy with an intense stare. Whether or not I care about Venus does not matter. What I want is in Venus's best interest, because our interests are aligned. I care about people, especially those who have been wronged by criminals. I care about them so much, in fact, that I am willing to remain on this terrifying place until my work here is concluded. Mundy sat in silence for a moment, contemplating. Then he started to smile. It was not a friendly smile, but the type of amused grin that one would expect to see on the face of a trickster god. All right, I can live with that justification. Almost. He leaned back and crossed his legs. I have a complete copy of everything Nina extracted. I just don't have it on me. Can you bring it here? Anita asked. No, but I am willing to bring you to it. Bateman had pleaded with Mundy, told him how dangerous it was if he was seen with Anita now that she had suspicious eyes on her. He rebutted that, as a well-known friendly person, he was merely showing a tourist how to experience the true thrill of living on Venus. All the while, Anita cursed the local spirits for their cruelty. She and Adam Mundy were standing in an airlock, and he was helping her put on an atmospheric suit. The fabric was thin and provided minimal heat insulation, but would keep her completely safe from the atmosphere. The rebreather unit clamped firmly around her torso was so light, she estimated it to barely last for 5 minutes, let alone the 12 hours that both Mundy and Bateman had assured her it was fully capable of handling. The helmet rested uncomfortably on her shoulders. Anita felt nothing of the alleged physio-adaptiveness with which the suit advertised itself to tourists. Though movement was barely restricted at all, Anita felt both over-encumbered with clothes and naked at the same time. Okay, so, pre-flight checklist, Mundy commenced. His voice carried over a speaker system in her helmet. He was clearly enjoying himself. Are the comms working? Anita nodded in response. It's difficult to see when you move your head. You have to use vocalization, Mundy insisted. Yes, said Anita. Very good. Now we have to see if everything is airtight. It all looks good to me, but you should run a systems check anyway. Press the check button on your ARM console, Mundy instructed. Gritting her teeth, Anita obliged, and immediately jumped up when a high-pitched alarm resounded in her helmet. A red light blinked next to the check button, and a small text window that appeared in the AR above it informed her of a circulation failure. Oh, sorry, I must have missed that, Mundy lied, barely able to contain himself. He stepped behind her and connected a tube from her rebreather pack to her helmet. "Check again, you should be good to go now." This time, no alarms went off, and the blinking light turned green. Though she generally had great trust in technology, Anita did not feel reassured. "We will go outside now," Mundi said. "Are you ready?" "No," Anita responded. Mundi initiated the pressure shift and opened the exit hatch. Anita felt a weak tug on her body, trying to pull her outside. On any other day, she would not have given it a second thought, but today she almost had a heart attack. She decided that she would not give this child the satisfaction of falling into panic on his watch, and stepped through the opening into a small area shielded from the winds and weather outside. With quivering legs, she followed Mundi through a corridor to the left, which curved right after a few meters, and then left again. Only now did the real outside come into view. Without windows to frame them, the terrifying storm clouds of Venus seemed even more gargantuan, even more threatening, and even more uncaring. Some were in a constant and rapid state of flux, shifting like sentient amoeba waiting for prey to take to the skies. Others looked almost as massive as rock faces, and elicited the same kind of awe and fear of being smashed to pieces against them. At the same time, they did not seem solid enough to bring even the slightest relief to her fear of falling down. It took all of her mental strain not to think about the literal inferno that was down there, on the surface. "You are an agent of the law. You have seen worse things, and you have attempted more difficult feats," she told herself, knowing and viscerally understanding that it wasn't true. "I'm actually just a student, but I'll take it as a compliment," Mundi responded. He descended a few steps onto a brightly illuminated platform and gestured over to a rack of alarmingly small foldable gliders. "Always make sure your glider is well fastened and secured before you deposit it," he informed as he pulled two of them off the rack. Anita hadn't even stepped onto the platform yet. The winds seemed to be a lot more virulent out here than they were in the corridor, which was obviously the entire purpose of the corridor in the first place. The interior spaces of Niobe had done a fantastic job at concealing the fact that yes, Venus also had winds, and winds this high up in the atmosphere could be quite strong. Adam Mundi handed her one of the gliders and pointed at two cables attached to the gripping handle. There was a carabiner on the end of each of them, painted bright green so they were easily visible even in the poorest conditions. "Fasten these to the latches on your belt," he instructed while doing so himself. There was something to be said for the hand movement in these suits, as securing herself to the glider was easy enough. Anita knew she should have felt safer, but somehow the sheer fact of the necessity of such safety measures unsettled her even more. As she attempted not to think about what would come next, she thought about what would come next, and froze. Mundi walked over to the edge of the platform and climbed over the chest-high railing. He had excellent control over his violently flapping glider, moving with and against it in just the right way. For a moment, Anita fled to the little spot of rational mind, wherein an argument as to how he was avoiding being ripped off the platform was taking place, only for that very same argument to devolve into the conviction that these gliders could not actually carry a human being, and Adam Mundi was trying to make Anita kill herself. It was at that exact moment that a gust of wind grabbed a hold of her own glider. She screamed in fear as the thing jerked her forward. For a moment it felt as though her legs would be ripped apart at the knees, and before she could realize that what she had been perceiving as the weight of her suit all this time was actually a set of magnetic boots, the wind overpowered them and pulled her up into the air. Anita had never felt as powerless as she did now. The glider pulled her up for a few meters, down a little, then to the side. She had no control over the damn thing, and her arms were not responding to the command of gripping onto the handle. When the glider's nose pulled down, she hit the ground hard and was dragged across the platform until it was caught in the railing. "Always keep your glider level when on a platform," Mundi scolded. "This is basic physics, really." "You could have fucking told me that," Anita spat. Who was this brat to treat her like this? She was a Slecker agent and a lifelong cop. She did not have to take shit from this barely post-pubescent boy with a sudden god complex. Red-hot anger coursed through her veins. Anita Matumbu got up, leveled her glider, and jumped. It took only the second she needed for the wind to carry her over the platform's edge to realize her terrible mistake. Below, a vortex of dark clouds peered at her like the eye of the devil itself. Ephemeral columns formed and dissipated, tentacles making ready to lunge and pull her down into hell. Her glider moved on its own, and it took a moment to realize that it was Mundi, hovering above, who had inserted his feet into two latches on top of the glider. He was steering her away from the main structure of Niobe, which she would have made intimate acquaintance with over the course of the next 10 seconds. "You are terribly inept at this, you know," the boy said. "You are an asshole for making me do this in the first place," Anita snapped back. "Well, you might be right, but at least you had the opportunity to prove yourself. I sometimes work as a flying instructor for tourists. Once they get over the fear, they start enjoying themselves." As they flew into the dawn at a speed that Anita had little in the way of reference to estimate, Adam explained to her how to operate the micro-thrusters on her suit and glider. It was all quite simple, really, mostly a matter of shifting body weight, though the height and the drop below was still unsettling. They had become easier to forget. Anita was unsure how long it took them to reach their destination, though it must have been at least an hour. The structure appeared behind the clouds without warning, a small, undecorated building suspended from a balloon twice its size. It only had a narrow landing platform, and Anita ended up stopping herself by bumping into the wall, but then Mundi might have flung her that way. He himself went about it with grace, decelerating just right so he would hit the metal in front of the entry hatch standing. Inside was a greenhouse, furnished in part like a teenage club hangout, with inflatable couches, an impressive sound system, and some herbs that Slecker only cared about if they were found in very large quantities. "So before I hand it over, I need to ask you one question," Mundi said as he deposited his glider right by the door and began typing on a computer. "Why are you doing this? You could have easily had Hong arrested on the DNA test alone. Why go to the trouble of getting this?" He held up a thumb drive. "I could say he would have slipped eventually, and I need it as evidence which Venus would not have provided if pressured from the outside, and that is certainly part of it." Anita was still holding on to her glider, hoping that they would go back out there without lingering. She didn't want to get too comfortable in here. That would only allow the fear to return. "When you are on the beat, as they say, you must lose the capacity to care. Otherwise, police work will rip you apart. I cannot help but care about justice. That was always my handicap. If this evidence helps Yook get back his future, it is worth it." Mundi handed her the thumb drive. "I am not giving this to a Slecker agent. I am giving this to a friend of Venus, I think." Anita smiled and stored it safely in her breast pocket. "Now if we are going to fly back, I think I would like to try and control this thing on my own." She tapped on the glider's handle. Less than a week later, a preliminary analysis of the source code from Anita's experts on Borman Station prompted Francis Ben Isaac to allow a search of Copeland Hong's residence. The sex android did end up being his undoing, but not from any residuals. These models put high value on hygiene. Instead, Ying-Ye, as she was called, had a significant amount of Hong's sperm frozen and kept in a compartment next to the artificial womb she was equipped with. If her master ever died, she would use it to make him a son who would inherit the fortune and shadowy empire of Wei Zheng. The bookmaker was greeted by a police escort when he stepped off a VAC train in Cairo and taken into custody. Slecker was organizing the prosecution, and the person bringing together its two most important elements was Anita Mutumbu, the organization's first Venus security liaison. It was a pro forma position, as Venuvian collaboration would only ever be granted if the crimes were heinous enough, and the criminals in question were a danger to Venus and her people. Still, it came with a healthy raise and regular trips to Niobe and Vulcan Station, and the top brass at Slecker were now showering her with praise and adoration, as she was their only foot in the door of the solar system's most reclusive legal sphere. Yook Masquerade was released after 45 days in jail and sentenced to 100 hours of community service in light of exonerating circumstances. His Welcome Back to Society party was the biggest event Esbarceló hosted in months. The young man was considered a hero on Venus and an interesting anecdote in the rest of the system. The Shukra Chase League disappeared for almost 2 Earth years, but instantly garnered a cult following on several worlds and habitats when it returned under the management of Nina Singh, Adam Mundi, and Yook Masquerade. Meanwhile, Wei Zheng's network was being dismantled. It turned out he was the keystone to so many operations that Slecker needed a special task force to deal with the cascade of unraveling threads they needed to follow. Anita was placed at the helm. Thus, one young man believing in himself against all odds led to the greatest bust in organized crime in the history of the solar system. The future was looking just fine. If you liked this story and would like to hear more, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. A new short story is uploaded every Wednesday, and there will occasionally be another one in between if I find the time. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day.